I think it would be safe to say that human identity can be typified by what we do, um, because we're always talking about it. In the morning, we talk about what we're going to do that day, and by the end of the day, we talk about what we've done for the entirety of that day, and sometimes we talk about what we did that week, or maybe for the month, or maybe for the year, and within that, there are specialized, more dense points that we like to refer to more than once. Those things we like to burn into the cast identity more than anything, especially if they can be considered accomplishments, or even more so rare, and all the better if it's virtuous. Um, the virtuous part always kind of has this glinting glow, and if we can get that, we're going to. Most of us, at least. Well, we're going to try to get that in there too, because when we talk about who we are, you know, we like to have that in there too because of the way the feedback feels, you know. And we know ahead of time. We anticipate the feedback. And that's a huge part of the game that we're playing. But if there isn't a symmetry between what you do and who you feel you are, there's gonna be problems for you down the road. It's an inevitability. And this isn't the first time anybody has ever said this. You know, it's an easy association to make that what you do and who you are one and the same. And you know, there are also the things that we think about, but those things can remain unknown to the world until they become something said or done, you know. And it's easy also, don't forget that we identify with our troubleshoot very, very strongly. That was one of the better observations of Alan Watts, was the way that we have a very strong troubleshoot. You know, we are always looking for holes or problems or the thing that's going to make things fall apart, you know, which are always there. But it's only half the story because, you know, to ascribe upside without downside, of course, is half the story, and to ascribe downside without upside is half the story. But, I mean, the question becomes, at the end of the day, even with overwhelming downside, do we not do the thing anyway? You know, I mean, how many times have people been completely sold on the idea that what they're about to do has tremendous downside, but they do it anyway because they have some small hope of this overwhelming upside. You know, it's the whole concept of risk, and that obviously has worked out pretty well because on the whole we are where we are. And that's the thing too. In the last video I said that very rarely does somebody say something original. 99.9% of the time it's not. And when I was saying that, I was mostly associating that to the political sphere, because it's especially true in the political sphere, but it's not even a criticism nor even really a bad thing. You know, it's less about the fact that it's not original and more about what a person does with the information that they've gotten. You know, that's the more important thing, because it's a constant sort of refraction. And somebody in the NBA, a basketball player, is likely to identify as such because that person does that all the time. And they're likely to never say that they're an NFL player, because they never do that. But an NFL player is very likely to say that they play in the NFL and they're a football player, because it's going to be associated to what we do. It's that simple. And like I said, if you can add virtue to that, or something that could even be interpreted as such, is even better. It's better to say that you're a champion basketball player. And if you were a basketball player and you spent the whole time losing, or you got cut, your first year, even though you did that, it's not likely you'll identify with it, because it doesn't have the same glinting virtue associated to it. It doesn't have victory, Even though it happened, it's less likely to be the thing that's broadcast. Or if you played in the NBA, that's still strong, but if you were never a starter, there's always going to be that thing, in the back of your mind where you're like, that kind of holds back the identification, even though it's a perfectly admirable thing, and it still puts you as part of a small fraction of people, and it still puts you as part of, the B bench to potentially a fantastic team who is very, very important, to be honest. Like, especially this day and age, there was a time in the NBA where really your starting five was the name of the game. Your starting five basically pushed and pushed and pushed, and when they were out, the bench was basically there to stop the bleeding or mitigate losing as much as possible. But this day and age, the bench is actually pushing too, and it's become a stronger, more proud situation. So yeah, that is certainly something to note. And you'll notice today, it's such a huge part of our overall endeavor to associate virtuousness to what we're doing, or what we're saying, or what we want to be perceived as. It's like we have to, in some way, twist and turn and bend and mold and reshape the truth so that there may be some sort of virtuousness extracted out of it and associated to us at all costs, even if it's an objectively horrible thing that is causing harm, that is definitely hurting people, and is definitely bad, and it's on its face not virtuous. It has to have that ascribed to it. And people will spend a great deal of time trying to locate that. And it's caused a massive social imbalance where the good is cast aside for the perceived virtue. And this is not an uncommon theme. And all people are susceptible to it. It's actually something that, if your cohort is the one in power, it's the one that has to maintain this veneer, because it's the thing that's going to keep you there. But if it's found to be not true, or if it's found to be a shell game or a bit of a mask, it only speeds up your loss. It has to be real. It has to be quantifiable. It has to be part of the actual identity. You can't just be saying it, because, it's always been true, but it's becoming more and more true with the age of the internet. You should probably, like I do, take what you see on the internet in terms of people's words and what they say with not much salt. It should exist as something that's theoretically true until shown to be true. Because, honestly, we have no idea who it even is. For all we know, it's a collection of bots, or like some scheme hatched up in some other country to attempt to bring something about that is of our detriment. Like, the simple fact is, we don't know. The weight of somebody's opinion who I know is so much heavier than 10,000 people who I don't even know who they are or what their motives are. If a person approaches a situation with a certain attitude, they are effectively operating in the negative before they even get to the launch pad of what could be considered objective. And very often we approach things like that with an attitude, let's say. I mean, if you can even call it that, I think that might be the best way to put it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We sometimes can't shake that, you know. It is the product of things that have happened and things that we think, you know. It's like it's hard not to approach something with a certain attitude, especially if that's the whole point, you know. If you're part of a political party, you're automatically approaching things with a certain attitude. You're automatically not objective, and it's to the benefit of the person in the party to still try to be objective. Like, that there is virtue in that. Like, that is actual identifiable virtue. To be part of a political party that has a preconceived notion that puts you in the negative within this little spectrum between objective and subjective, and still manage to say what's true. It's highly unvirtuous to be swallowed up by the party and approach things from a certain attitude and stay there and never get out of it. That there's it's worse than non-virtuous. It's like it's kind of like a humiliation to the integrity of a person, you know, to approach things from the point of view of a preconceived notion, one of which lays a screen over events and over reality that makes it to where you inherit events non-objectively from the go. It's almost like you have things boxed up and ready to ship out before they even happen. From the point of view of a party whose interests you really don't have a say over, especially when you're one of the foot soldiers out, you know, in the field, so to speak. You're not the center. You're not a lieutenant. I mean, those people have a serious interest in navigating such things in the interest of the party, because, I mean, to anybody who hears that, it's immediately obvious why, you know. But if you're way out there on the ground, like you find yourself on the outside of virtue if you can't shake that. It's no better than doing things for any other organization that oversimplifies the world and adds a preconceived notion that you never break out of, you know, especially something like a political party. I mean, to the free thinkers of the world, to the people who have thought freely over time, political parties have always been almost like a sickness to them. And to them, so heavily identifying with one of them has seemed like an extreme sickness, something that will always inflict itself upon the way one thinks. It turns everything in reality, in this whole vast thing, into something that's either an advantage or a disadvantage to the party and thus the person. And it's just so much more than that. The reason why I said that in the last video is because so many people have been absorbed into the political sphere, and it's such a dominant thing in the lives of people. And while everybody is unique, you know, and everybody says it with a slight variance, you know, there is a uniformity in any political party. I mean, that's kind of the very nature of a political party, isn't it? You know, uniformity. But in the United States, it's a particular situation because the political parties encompass the whole of the political sphere. It's the most extreme to the most moderate of each side in two halves, which is always technically, that's like the most reduced possible situation in a healthy political scheme, to have at least two, because if you have one, all you have is a force that is dominant and an eventual revolution. You can't have anything that is truly singular. Within that singular thing, you sow the seeds of its division just by calling it singular, thinking of it as singular. It's a mistake to think of anything that way. Anything singular inevitably divides. So you have to have at least two to make up the whole political process. It has to be divided into a left and a right, so to speak, or an up or a down, or an on or an off. And they sort of take turns. Over time, if you look at the history of the United States, there's been two dominant forces that have sort of taken turns. And it's their objective in this game to cause as many people as possible to identify with what they're pitching. And it's remarkable as humans, the degree to which a single persuasive person can bring 99 people into their cause. One person can convince 99 people to come with them and persuade them that there even is a cause, and bring them to the door of this cause and go against it. Even whether true or untrue, a truly persuasive person can keep this going. And the tightness of these binds are made even more if the initial pitch is eventually met in the world. Like I said, it's about what we do. It's the ride. Say you do actually meet this thing in the world that this persuasive person was talking about, and you defeat it. Well, now you're bound. All of you are bound for life. You're a political organization. You are a free-floating idea, and now you need more. Now you have a myth. You have a story. You have a day-to-day thing to tell other people, and other people can only dream of having the same success that you did, especially if it's a triumphant, massive victory against all odds. That's has an even larger gravity, some of the most gravity that there could be in human affairs, winning against the odds. If it was a matter of course that you were always just going to completely dominate and win, of course there's gravity there, but it's nowhere near as much as going against the odds. Even if you were always going to win, you were the superior force, but you can make it seem as if it's against the odds. That tightens the bonds. It makes it all stronger. And especially a place like Europe has had many, many hundreds of years to play this all out. I mean, in my opinion, Europe has been quite a factory for statecraft and politics, So much so that a lot of our stories take place in the courts of Europe. It's some of the most intriguing stories, sets of stories, ideas. And watching how these people can spend a lifetime identifying with a cause. They always have to be talking about it, and they always have to be doing it if they truly identify with it. They live it and they breathe it. And within this, there are such a number of different types of people. And strangely, too, in the end, it can be hard to say. It's like a chicken and an egg scenario. Sometimes you think it's like, who's to stop an incredibly persuasive person from just sort of turning a fiction into a reality? And I would genuinely be curious how many times that's happened, where this initial pitch was maybe had some seeds in reality, but in the end was fictional. and this person manages to just sweep up a bunch of people into it and turn it into the truth. I would fair to say that's probably happened pretty often. And how many times has a person worn the armor shielding of glinting virtue only to have a story come out, about their lack of virtue, the direct opposite, and it just breaks them. That's a situation where a person has eliminated the possibility of not having any virtue in their life or non-virtue in their life whatsoever, and any sign of it is completely devastating. And we do set up these circumstances quite often where a person is supposed to be completely virtuous all the time, and those people end up being extremely exemplary because it's not easy as humans. Like, we are entities of virtue and non-virtue. We are animal and divine. We are both. So, it's almost like I've said in the past, like, there's a time and a place for both. Like, winning in battle is virtuous, but the actual battle itself isn't. You, literally swinging swords around, lopping people's heads off and hacking people up and screaming like an animal, like a raging beast. But in the end, the story you tell is of gallant and sweet victory. It's a combination of both, and it's how a person wears that, and how a person wears that affects how they talk about it. And these things can really turn into legends and myths, as they have, and they will. It's always a situation too of the human will up against a completely seemingly random circumstance. The external circumstance that constantly butts up against human will is viewed as the chaos or the randomness or the eternal entropy of all that there is. And the human will is viewed as this fine, glinting point that shapes it according to that person's needs and wants and everything. Which isn't an accurate way to look at it. It's like your home, your little starting point, is a place that is most surrounded with and made up of your will. It is literally populated with you. And I would even fair to say that our atoms and our cells are all over the place. It sheds everywhere. It's like there's no more place that's more us than our home. But as soon as we start leaving it, and the further we get away from it, the more we are bringing ourselves and inviting in this force of entropy that is always surging and going, and our will has to be more and more. I mean, the actual palpable sense of ourselves has to be supported by a will that really knows what it wants. And I've talked about feeling as a good barometer, but I don't just say, sort of random emotions. I don't say that what a person feels is because of this entropic force within us. The reason I feel things is because of a history of what I've seen as true things come to pass. It's sort of a combined sum of all I know in response to what is happening. It's not a random up and down that I'm on some ride with, The reason I feel, you can call it your gut or whatever, is because I've had verifiable events previously to associate to reality. So when something happens and I feel some way about it, it is that long line of true things that I have seen and done incorporating itself to what is happening, and my nervous system and all of my senses respond accordingly. And it's for that reason that I'm able to completely trust myself to the moment, with some amount of preconception and adopting some kind of attitude about anything that I'm about to get into. But mostly, I completely trust myself in just about any situation, and I don't have any qualms about entering them. And the way I feel about them is because of the true things that I know, even if it's things that end up being not true. It just calibrates the way I feel in real time. And sometimes it's like exercising ghosts, like you can feel them depart or change, like chemicals in you. But emotions aren't so much just completely random ebbs and flows within a person that are always chaos. They are there as signals up against all of the true things that a person knows. If you love somebody and you see that person and you feel this strong, sharp, binding love in their presence, it's because of all that you know to be true. Any emotion that we could feel, especially later in life, has a strong root in all that we've done and all that we know to be true. And until such things change, the way we feel won't. And our will and our identity are tied together because you have to get some wins in life. It's like I've said in the past, you need some evidence and proof of who and what you are. It's why people have been motivated to just cast themselves out into the world, because they want to find out. Like they haven't felt that it's sufficient at home alone to truly find what's in them, what they can withstand, what kind of patience they have, or if what they end up doing and saying has within it the laced, gilded ways of virtue. And that's how I've said too, there's virtue in even recognizing the animal in a person, the beast as well. There's an overarching virtue in that. And it's so helpful just in life in general to have access to both, like there really is a time and a place for both. And the way a person feels, the way a person responds, the way a person behaves is so strongly correlated to those two things, and knowing when to be which, or to be both. And there's always some ratio, when to behave yourself and when to be a beast, And this day and age too, it's like I've said in the past as well, like we are dealing with the internet, where it's just so easy to present an image and not actually live that way. It's like it causes a distortion in the world, And we're just kind of like figuring it out, I suppose. And it's the reason why that word authenticity has come up so much lately, because we just can't stand not having it and not seeing it in people. We like what you do and what you say to be the same thing. We like people telling the truth and representing reality with their words as accurately as possible. We just can't stand the other way, because it makes us think that you think that we're not clever enough to figure out what reality actually is surrounding you, Just because it's not surrounding us and it's surrounding you doesn't mean we're not clever enough to figure it out. And so much of human endeavor is that situation, It's like I have my sphere You have yours. To what degree can you properly represent or accurately represent your sphere? How good are you at that? And how well can you do it? It's actually kind of difficult to get it right. And not just get it right, get it beautiful. Because once a person is doing something beautifully, they have so mastered it that it's art. And that's, we like to see that. That's the highest level of human being, in my opinion. When you can not just get it right, but get it beautiful too. That's what we gather around to look at. It's not just somebody slapping a paintbrush on a canvas. Anybody can do that. It's when you get it right and get it beautiful. And we can sit there and look at it and talk about it. And every time we look at it, it's like the first time. And we can go out into the world and we can have some different series of experiences and then view the whole thing totally differently. That's art. That's beauty. But there has to be something approximating the truth there. And and we've come quite a ways. Obviously, this is starting to get pretty sophisticated for beings to have this level of interpretation going on for reality, for the world. And it's such a fine and deep tunnel, the human way, It's like it blows my mind sometimes how easy it is to forget about mortality and to forget about all those who have come and gone, those vast, deep stories, to forget about the vastness of the universe, to forget that we're potentially alone, to forget about all these mortal things just because somebody else is talking and they're interesting and I love them. It's so easy to get completely immersed and lost in that. And not just anybody. I'm talking about a specific person. It's crazy how you can, even in some degrees, for the people that you favor, your friends, and different stories you can hear even of strangers. It's crazy how a person can just so easily forget about all those big things and just get immersed in the small things and have them completely take up your awareness and your attention for that time. I guess that is the subjective part up against the objective, because if we were just objective all the time, it would be too sanitary, too clean. There wouldn't be any dust at all. It would just be space. So you have to have the objective and the subjective together, just like the animal and the divine, and just like the left and the right. You have to have these two colliding, seeming opposites, and the place where they meet is time itself. It's the place where things and space meet. It's time itself, and that will continue to be the case. And when it comes to identity too, it's interesting how among all of the things that we do, we pick out certain things, because there's technically an infinite number of true things at any given point. At any time, there is what you could consider an infinite amount of true things. But we pick certain things sort of in a cohesive way too, that have common associations to previous things we picked. Because when I approach somebody, I don't just tell them that I ate spaghetti yesterday, even though it's true, unless it has some link to how I see not only my identity, but my association with that person. It would be different if me and that person ate spaghetti every time we met. But if there wasn't some particular circumstance like that, it would be meaningless to say I ate spaghetti yesterday. But that's how it is, If there is some link in the identity, plus the identity that binds people, then there's more obvious relevance. And the relevance is, of course, extremely obvious like that. It comes in a feeling. When something is so true, you can feel it That is like the highest point of human being. And when I talk about feeling, I don't just talk about emotion. There's much more to feeling than emotion. Emotion is the charge, it's the movement, it's the motion. But the textures and the details are the entire experience of a person and their imagination as well. And sometimes we have to feel and hold back a little bit. There are various situations where a person approaches, and it's pretty much, I guess you can say it's the case with most people, where people approach each other almost as question marks. It's interesting how that is, and there's a lot we can assume about each other, and the things that we wear and the way that we carry ourselves has in that stored everything we know, everything we think. It's somehow stored in us like that in the present moment, and a lot can be inferred about a person's identity about that. You can't fully judge because of that, but you can infer some things. And then once the speaking begins and the communication begins, there's either a verification or a dismissal of those inferences. But that's always been one of the more fascinating things about being a human, is having these question marks kind of approach you, and you yourself as a question mark, even though you know yourself so intimately. There's even things about ourselves that we have to learn in this way. But it's always been interesting with other people, seeing your own ability to infer things and find out how close you were or how far off you were. And even these things contribute to our sense of other people and our sense of reality at large, even our sense of ourselves. And it's interesting how, if a person does come truly to love, and when I say that word, I don't just mean it haphazardly, as a general word for all people. I mean for a specific person. It's a place where everything is different. It's a place where the bind is just so intimate you can hardly describe it. There's this sense of just incredible familiarity, yet newness at the same time. But just like with the political parties, there are huge degrees in between. And it's always going to be an interesting thing to think about what a person identifies with and why.